In today's episode, we sit down with Gregg Korrol, the author of The Gifted Storyteller. He'll discuss the strategies and techniques that he used to write and edit his first book.
Welcome to this edition of Peak Performers Podcast with your host, Thor Conklin. Thor will be sharing the necessary tools, strategies, and psychology you'll need to become a peak performer in any area of your life or business.
Thor Conklin here. We give you the tricks, the tips, the tools, the strategy, the technology, and the psychology peak performers use in order to get more done and execute at the highest level. If you know what to do but struggle with getting it all done, or simply want to raise your game to the next level, this podcast is for you. Sit back and enjoy. Gregg Korrol works in the field of education with over 20 years of experience as a teacher and administrator in the New York City school system. He is the author of The Gifted Storyteller. The book is about the voice inside your head, i.e., the gifted storyteller. You know this voice. It's the voice that's in your head, and at any moment, that voice can take any situation and make it an opportunity or a horror story. Gregg, alongside his dad, are the ones responsible for the wildly successful new startup, Yoogen.com, YOOGEN.com. Yoogen is the first pain relief wrap for eliminating menstrual cramps in less than 5 minutes. Based on the principles of acupuncture, Yoogen places pressure right below the knee to eliminate pain during the woman's cycle. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know the audience is going to get so much out of today's episode. And start us off with the new book that you have coming out.
Well, first off, Thor, thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you. I mean, obviously, we've spoken in person and hung out, but this is a great opportunity to be on your show, so I really thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
I wrote a book called The Gifted Storyteller. The best way to explain this book, or rather, maybe I should start with what is the Gifted Storyteller. Really, it's essentially about that voice in your head. We all have a voice in our head that guides us throughout our every single day. As somebody once said to me a long time ago, no matter where you go in your life, no matter what happens in your life, you are going to wake up with yourself and you're going to go to sleep with yourself. And during that, 16-hour window, if you will, you kind of have this little voice that's talking you through your day and giving you feedback and giving you comments and interpreting the world. So when I spent time thinking about how amazing that voice is, and just the fact that you can have all these people who can witness the same exact experience and yet experience it in a very different way. So 10 people could look at the same situation and have a very different experience or interpretation of that. And I kind of sat with this thought and I was like, wow, that's brilliant. Because if a person could really do that, in other words, if you had the ability to see all these opportunities in front of you, or you could turn a situation into a horror story, that's truly a gift. In other words, that's brilliance. So I came up with this term of the gifted storyteller to refer to that voice in your head, the voice that's guiding your everyday.
Now, how do we control that voice in our head?
That's the key, and that's the interesting part. There's really many ways to do it that really begins with awareness. In other words, I know, obviously, we've all met many people, and, we all have friends or family members who, we relate to and talk to us, but some people feel like they're just going. And when they're feeling something or when they're experiencing something, they're kind of subject to it. In other words, for lack of better words, they're a slave to whatever their mind is telling them. Whereas I kind of have realized over time that that's not exactly you. Because the fact that you can hear that voice and the fact that you can technically control that voice shows that there's something greater sitting behind the steering wheel, if you will. So I think the first step in really controlling that voice is just being aware that it's there. In other words, we've all had this experience where we drive to work or we're reading a book and, you get to the end of the page or you get to your destination and you really have no concept how you got there. In other words, you took certain streets, you stopped at traffic lights, you read a bunch of words on a page, but your mind kind of was spinning a story and you weren't even present. You were elsewhere. I think the first step in controlling that voice and controlling your mind is really just being aware that you're kind of traveling off somewhere, or as I term it, that you're storytelling at a given moment and you're creating a story around something.
Interesting. Now, are there more than one storyteller or is there just one in there? Seems like sometimes I've got several in there talking at the same time.
Well, I definitely can understand that. But I mean, to me, I think it's that one storyteller that's spinning several different stories or several different angles based on how you're feeling or what you're thinking.
Interesting. Maybe he's got different accents and speaks different languages.
1,000%. It's amazing that you can even hear these. I read these stories every now and again in the news about people who go into comas and then wake up either speaking a different language or speaking with a different accent, literally coming out of a coma and then speaking in a country western accent as opposed to a British accent that they may have. And it's pretty interesting what's going on in there.
That's fascinating. It's interesting because our mind is there to protect us. And I think so often we go into this loop almost where this voice or this mind within us is doing things that may be counterintuitive to what we're trying to accomplish in our life, our goals, our outcomes, our results that we're trying to accomplish. And it's, people say it's sabotaging. It's almost working behind the scenes.
I agree with you. I mean, the fact is, it is there to protect you. If you think about anything you ever worry about, anything you're ever disappointed about, and I'm associating this more with the negative feelings, there tend to be your brain just kind of telling you, or that voice kind of telling you, like, be careful, or plan ahead, or, this person or this situation is upsetting to you and you should stay away from it. So, yeah, it's definitely a protection mechanism.
I think you bring up a really good point about the acknowledgement, because I find if you acknowledge that voice and say, okay, I understand why you're doing what you're doing right now, it almost puts it to ease or put it to rest. It's when you fight it is when you put that energy into it where it fights back.
Okay, so going back to the book, aside from it being about the voice in your head, it's largely about this character taking a journey. His name is Michael, and he's kind of in a position in life where everything seemingly is successful. In other words, he has a great job, he's making money, he has his own place, all the things that most people would perceive as success, he's got. Except he's sitting there questioning, is this it? In other words, okay, I've got the job, I've got some money, I'll eventually meet somebody, I'll have a kid, and then I'll die. He's kind of going through that whole, is this it type of situation. So he meets this woman named Jeannie, who introduces him to the voice in his head, but sort of helps him use that voice to steer his life. So there comes a point in the book where he realizes, and he's starting to get better at realizing, that his mind is going off on a tangent, that he's storytelling. And he turns to her after he begins having a story or a fantasy, if you will, about her, and he kind of questions, how do I stop this thing? In other words, it seems to just constantly be going. How do I stop it? And she gives back the advice of kind of what you're talking about, which is really you have to, once you become aware, once you kind of see the story happening, that's your first step. Then the next step is to really just take a deep breath and just look around you. Be present where you are. Look at what's in front of you. Hear sounds that are around you. Take maybe smell something that's in your environment, because anything that's connected to where you are and what you're doing is going to bring you back to that present moment and kind of end that story.
Fascinating. And, one of the best questions I always recommend people to ask themselves is it true? And when you start to really dive down into that question, a lot of times you say, I'm not quite sure if it is or not.
Yeah, I'm not so, there are times where I'm not so sure any of it's true. Because if you think about it, you have a 24-hour day. 8 hours of that day are spent sleeping, so you're basically left with 16, of course, give or take, depending on your own routine. And if you think about how much of a story is going on for 16 hours in your head, if you will, and then what you actually talk about to other people, or what you articulate or write down somehow, you're only taking a very small slice of everything that you're thinking. And you have to question how much of it is true. Because even the fact that you can be swayed by having a good day or having a bad day, or a certain person you might encounter, it's going to sway the way your experience is going. So it's interesting to question the truth of that story at any given time, because given another opportunity, another day, another situation, another scenario, you may have made a very different conclusion or had a very different truth, if you will, about how to go forward.
Yeah, it's where you're looking from, what your beliefs are, is going to determine what you think the meaning is. No
Exactly.
question. there's a lot of people out there that want to write their first book. How did you do it? Why did you do it? And what were some of the hurdles that you had to overcome?
I've actually wanted to write a book pretty much my whole life. I mean, I've enjoyed writing. It's always been something. I took up writing back when I was in high school, and I used to write poems, and I used to just journal. It's amazing, actually, how many journals I have filled between the ages of probably 14 and, 24, because I did most of my writing back then. Just writing and writing and writing. So when it came to wanting to write a book, which is something I've always wanted to do, it was kind of one of those moments where you kind of took a, what's the best word to, you kind of took an assessment of where you are in life. And being in my low 40s, I kind of sat there and said, wow, I remember saying at 20 and articulating that to friends, I really want to write a book one day. And here I am 20 years later, and I still hadn't done it. And then that kind of thought and fear overcame me, where I said to myself, am I going to be 20 years in the future looking back and saying, I still haven't done this? And am I okay with that? And the reality is I wasn't. I was like, there's no way you're going to spend another 20 years and look back and kind of say, you haven't done, to myself, say I haven't done certain things that I've wanted to do in my life. So I kind of gave myself a little, kick in the backside, a little pain, always goes a long way.
Yes.
And forced myself into a certain routine. So I said, okay, what's the minimum you can do? Like, give me something. This is, of course, my conversation with me. And I said, 15 minutes. In other words, I'm working all day, come home, spend time with my family. I put my daughter to bed every night, and we'll spend a good half an hour to an hour on that whole bedtime routine. But then it was like, okay, you can give 15 minutes. Just 15 minutes, sit down and write. And prior to that, it was even with thinking about, and this is going back to your comment from earlier about the mind and fear, well, am I supposed to have, the chapters laid out? Should I have a storyline developed? Because you hear about how different writers write. And I had said to myself at that point, you know what? We're not doing that anymore. Here's the deal. 15 minutes, sit down, start writing, no concept, see where it goes. The only thing I knew I did want to get across were certain life lessons. In other words, there are many things I had learned over the course of my life that have really helped me improve my life, get to a better place. And there were so many lessons from so many teachers that were so prevalent that I wanted to make sure that was there. And that was the concept of where it came from. So I promised myself the 15 minutes, and I sat down. I literally sat down. And I remember that first night because it was kind of like, where do you even begin? But at the same time, I was going through a different type of experience where my wife's father was actually going into a hospice. He was dying. And I used that concept as the initial kickoff of the book, because Michael actually begins in the hospital with his father, who he knows is imminently going to die. And that's how the book actually kicks off.
Wow.
So I think that's kind of, if I would say what are the combinations, it's number one, kind of fast forward your life. I know people have different terms for this. They call it the rocking chair test. I kind of call it like looking at a photo album. In other words, if I could picture myself at 80, looking through my pictures and showing them to my grandkids or showing them to my friends, what are the stories I want those pictures to have? What are the stories I want those pictures to tell? So I wanted to make sure one of those stories had to do with me being an author. So I put myself in a certain place mentally. Then I committed myself to even something simple and minimal that was very small. I mean, how can you not do 15 minutes? It's kind of like when you say to yourself, how can you not do 10 minutes of exercise a day? It's that kind of thing that you have to just say it's minimal, but it never amounts to that. That's the interesting part. So sitting down for 15 minutes was never 15 minutes. It always became more because I kind of got into it. Did that happen every single day? No. I mean, I sat down every single day, and some days just flowed more than others. And other days just didn't flow that well. And the next day I would have to delete some stuff or change some of the wording or whatever else. And that's fine too. Another thing I tried to eliminate that helped a lot was eliminating punishment. In other words, not getting upset with myself, not saying, oh, you should have done this, or, you're not having a good day, or whatever the case is. I eliminated that whole concept of self-punishment, if you will. I think that was also a big thing because we tend to criticize ourselves heavily. And so I said, there's no criticism here. I didn't even tell anybody I was doing this. And I think that kind of also helped too. In other words, it's not like I said to everybody, oh, I'm going to start writing a book. And then people started asking me questions. I actually didn't tell anybody, aside from my wife who saw me writing every day, until the book was pretty much done.
Interesting. How long did it take you to actually write the book?
The majority of it was written in about 4 months, I'd say. So in other words, every night, and again, I would say 15 minutes, but it really sometimes became an hour or longer. And the majority of it was 4 months. And like when you're doing anything, sometimes you can sustain it for a significant period of time, but then it kind of fades off when other things pop up in your life. And that's kind of what happened. So I found myself skipping days, and then days became weeks, and so forth. So I didn't really write for a period of time until one day, I think 3 or 4 months later, where I picked up and reread everything that I wrote. And it just sort of came to me again. Well, this is where the character should go next, and this is what should happen next. So I think it was a couple of evenings in July where I started writing again, but again, the same thing happened. I didn't do much of anything. And then now fast forward 6 months later, and it was like Christmas time, and I had some time to myself, so I reread what I wrote. But what was most interesting about it was that when you take that much distance from something, you can read it very objectively and see it as if it's somebody else. And I sat there going, wow. And I started learning from what I had read, yet I had written it, if that makes any sense.
It does, yes.
And so I found it really interesting, and then I just got back into it and continued. And at that point, it really closed out. I think it was literally, the date was January 2nd, actually, when I finished off the book. And it was kind of one of those moments like, where else should it go? Where else should it go next? And I just felt like, you know what? This is where it needs to be. It doesn't need to be a long read. It's not one of these books that you're going to pick up and that's, the size of an encyclopedia, and that you have to think, when am I going to find time for this? Pretty much everybody who's read it, actually, no, that's everybody who's read it has read it in literally 2 settings. It's not a long book. It's 130 pages. It's a quick read, but it leaves you thinking. And that's kind of the books that I like to read in my life. And being that I don't have a lot of time because of all that's going on, I wanted to make sure that I gave to others the same type of opportunity. Something that you would enjoy, something that you could definitely get into in terms of the story, but that would also leave you thinking. And maybe you'd find a couple of connections with your own life or things that would benefit you.
Yeah, I love authors that keep things short. It's like, please stop pontificating. Just get me the information. Get it to me fast. I love Audible books, and I've trained myself now to listen to them at 2.0 speed. And it's funny. I listened to one at regular speed. It's like, hello. It's like, wow, I can't do it anymore. I'm originally from New York too, so we speak fast as it is. So
yes.
It's like, all right, let's go. It sounds like it took you a year basically from start to finish, but maybe the actual writing was a 4-month writing process. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's about right.
And then what about after you had it written? They say writing it's one thing, but going back and rewriting it and editing it, that takes a lot of time. Was that in the 4 months as well?
No. Then, there was some editing during that time, but basically what happened after that is I gave it out to 2 of my cousins read it. My wife actually read it, obviously. And, while they gave me awesome feedback, their feedback was very interesting because it wasn't like, oh, great book, I really enjoyed it. It was more of a surprise factor. It was like, wow, I didn't expect this. And to me, that was gold. In other words, just having that, taking them out of what they could have expected or would have expected to get from it, and just hearing that they genuinely were taken aback and surprised and enjoyed it was awesome. But after that point, I had also given it to somebody who is actually a well-published author who I'm fortunate enough to know. And he read a little of it, and he said to me, he's like, you have a lot going here, but you really need to reread it. And that sometimes it helps to just sit on it and take a little time away from it, pick it up again in 6 weeks, and look back through it. And so I followed his advice and put it down, and then kind of picked it up, a month and a half later, and kind of reread, and then started tweaking. And that process actually took several months at that point, because there were 2 things going on. One, at that point, I was also looking for a publisher and looking for somebody to get it out there. But also it was a matter of getting it to a state where I thought it was good enough to go. What I've since learned, even at this point, with the book coming out in less than a month, and still having reread it a few times because I'm also working on the audiobook for it, but there's still words that can be changed. There's pieces that can be added. I kind of understand when some people say that it's a never-ending piece. In other words, when you're working on something, you can constantly revise and edit it. But there has to be a point where you kind of say to yourself, okay, this is it. This is where it's going to be. This is I'm happy with this. The other side of the coin is there are certain people who are perfectionists, and they're constantly chasing to make better, make better, make better. But sometimes in all that making better, you're actually making things worse.
That definitely makes sense. So you didn't have any professional editor look at the book. You did it. You wrote it. You edited it. And then instead of going the self-publishing route, you said you found a publisher.
Yeah, I'm fortunate to have worked with Motivational Press. There's a guy named Justin Sachs who runs the whole gambit, and he picked it up. I met him through another person that I met. Actually, it was one of those things of a friend of a friend of a friend.
Yeah.
So I was taking a class with somebody, and she's like, I have a friend who's an author. Maybe I can just put you in touch with her, and she can give you some guidance and advice. So I spoke with her for some guidance and advice, but when she asked about what the book was about, she found it very interesting, and she's like, you know what? I'm going to contact my publisher and see if he'd be willing to talk to you. And a couple of weeks later, I got an email from him, and we had to set up literally a 60-second or 120-second conversation on the phone, and it was enough for him to say, okay, send me what you have. So I sent him a couple of chapters at that point. I didn't send the whole thing. He wanted a table of contents and a couple of chapters, and sure enough, about a month later, he made me a publishing offer.
For the last 16 years, I've been driven by the question of why some people achieve amazing results and others don't. The answer? 90% of their success came from their psychology. So if 90% of their success comes down to their psychology, what was the one thing that enabled them to produce the results that others were not? Their ability to execute. Their ability to get things done. Now, we all know how to get things done, but some of us do it better than others. And some of us are not even coming close to tapping our potential. So if you're truly committed to tapping your potential and really becoming a peak performer and getting the results that you need, want, and desire, take your phone and text the word BE Summit. That stands for Business Execution Summit. One word, BE Summit, and text that to 41411. I'm going to send out some additional information on our upcoming event that will truly teach you the science of execution. Thank you so much for listening today. I really do appreciate your time, and I hope you found today's show valuable. If you would like to receive these shows automatically to your phone or to your computer, simply go to iTunes and subscribe. After listening to several of the shows, if you're so inclined, please leave us a 5-star rating, as this helps us reach additional people and spread the message. If you're truly committed to taking your life to the next level and doing whatever it takes to become a peak performer, but something's holding you back, something is blocking your way, and you just can't seem to figure out what it is, send me an email to info@thorconklin.com, and I'd be more than happy to get on the phone with you. We'll schedule a 15-minute discovery call. No obligation, no cost. I absolutely love to hear from the listeners, and if there's something I can do to help, I'd be more than happy to do that. Also, if you found something of great interest in today's show and you want to share that with your friends and family, simply go to my Facebook page, Thor Conklin, click on the episode, hit the share button, and share it on your page. You can follow me at Twitter at Thor Conklin. The website is thorconklin.com. We're constantly adding new free resources, discussing additional tricks, tips, tools, and strategies on how to be a peak performer. Remember, I try to keep these episodes short so you can listen to them during dot time, doing other things, commuting, driving, walking, working out. Decide to be a peak performer in all that you do. And until tomorrow, have an absolutely amazing day. That concludes part 1 of our interview with Gregg Korrol. Please stay tuned later this week for part 2.